On the edge of a small colony world, far away from Earth, lived a man named David. He was not rich, and he was not famous, but he had a simple home, a small farm, and a quiet life. His days were filled with work, and his nights were filled with silence. Even the stars above felt more like company than the people around him. For David was a man who lived alone, and loneliness followed him like a shadow. One morning, David walked into the labor market of the colony town. He needed help with his farm, someone to cook, someone to clean, someone to share the work that never seemed to end. He had tried to hire workers before, but humans in the colony never stayed for long. The pay was not high, the farm was far from the city, and the work was hard. So David searched again, hoping maybe today he would find someone desperate enough to stay. The labor market was a crowded place, filled with voices, offers, and desperate eyes. There were men and women from many species, humans and aliens both. Some shouted their skills, others begged for food. But in the corner, sitting on the cold ground, was one figure who did not call out at all. She was an alien woman, thin and tired, her clothes torn, her eyes dull, but still holding some hidden fire. She carried no belongings except a small necklace clutched in her hand. No one came near her, no one asked for her name. To them, she was invisible, worthless, just another alien widow without protection. David paused, his eyes drawn to her silence. He had seen many workers before, but something about her was different. While others shouted to be noticed, she sat alone, quiet, as if she had already given up. Curiosity made him step closer. "What is your name?" David asked, his voice gentle but firm. The woman lifted her eyes slowly, as if even speaking cost her strength. "Lyra," she said, her voice soft and broken. Her accent was heavy, but the word was clear. The overseer of the market noticed David talking to her, and he hurried over. "You don't want that one," the overseer whispered, shaking his head. "She is a widow from the last war, her people lost, her husband dead. No one trusts her kind. She is nothing but trouble." David frowned, his jaw tight. "She can work, can't she?" The overseer shrugged. "Perhaps, but she is weak, and she carries sorrow like a disease. No one will hire her. She will not last a week." But David did not look away. He saw not just weakness, but a story untold. Something inside him pushed against the warnings. "Stand up," David said to Lyra. She rose slowly, her movements tired but graceful in their own way. She avoided his eyes, as if afraid he would change his mind if he saw the truth in them. "I will hire her," David said firmly. The overseer blinked in surprise, then laughed softly. "Your choice, human, but don't say I didn't warn you." When Lyra followed David back to his home, the colony whispers began. Neighbors muttered, "Why would a human hire her kind? Does he not know what she is?" Some even laughed, saying David was desperate enough to bring an alien widow into his house. But David ignored them. He cared little for gossip. He only knew that his farm needed help, and perhaps this woman needed a place to belong. At first, Lyra moved quietly through the house, her steps soft, her voice nearly absent. She cleaned without being told, cooked simple meals, and worked in the fields with hands that trembled but never stopped. She never asked for more than food and shelter, never spoke of her past, never smiled. David watched her from a distance, curious about the mystery she carried. At night, he sometimes saw her standing outside, looking at the stars, whispering words in her alien tongue. Her hand always touching the necklace she kept close to her heart. The farm began to change, the house no longer silent, the fields more alive. But questions grew in David's mind. Who was she before she came here? What did she whisper to the stars? And why did her eyes sometimes fill with tears when she thought he wasn't watching? Though she lived under his roof, she still felt like a stranger. And yet, in the quiet moments, David felt something he had not felt in years, the sense that his home was no longer empty. But deep in his heart, he also felt a warning. For every secret carries a price, and every decision carries a future. And David's choice to hire the alien widow was not the end of his loneliness. It was the beginning of a story that would change everything. Days turned into weeks, and Lyra's presence in David's house became part of his routine. She moved quietly through the rooms, her footsteps soft, her hands always busy, her voice almost never heard. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was strange. It felt as if the walls of his home had learned to breathe again, yet still held their breath. Waiting, David noticed many small things about her. She cooked with care, but never tasted the food herself until he insisted. She cleaned every corner, but her eyes often drifted to the old photographs of his family. Sometimes he would find her staring at the picture of his parents, her expression unreadable. At night, she slept in the small guest room, but often he saw her shadow passing the windows, walking outside beneath the stars. One evening, David stepped outside and found her standing barefoot in the field. Her hands were lifted, her lips moving in words he did not understand. The night wind carried her voice like a secret prayer. When she noticed him watching, she lowered her hands quickly, clutching the necklace around her neck. "I am sorry," she whispered, as if she had done something wrong. David shook his head. "You don't need to be sorry. Just what were you saying?" She looked away, the silver of the moon reflecting in her eyes. "Names," she said softly. "I was saying names." Before he could ask more, she walked back into the house, leaving him with questions that gnawed at his mind. The next day, David tried to learn more. He asked where she came from, what her people were like, what she hoped to do here. But Lyra always answered in the smallest way possible, giving him no more than she had to. It was as if her life had been cut into pieces, and she was guarding the fragments that remained. David felt frustration, but also pity. He had never known someone who carried silence like a shield. And yet, when he looked into her eyes, he felt there was a storm behind that silence. The neighbors were less patient. Rumors spread like wildfire in the small colony. "She works in his home, but gives him nothing but bad luck," some said. "Her kind bring war and sorrow." Others whispered. David heard these words when he went to the market, when he walked down the street. But he ignored them. For every day he returned home to find his fields more alive, his house more warm, and his own heart less heavy. And deep inside, he could not deny the truth. He looked forward to her presence. Her silence had become part of his days, her shadow part of his nights. One night, David woke to a sound. It was soft, but different from the usual creaks of the house. He followed the noise and stopped at Lyra's door. It was slightly open, and through the crack he saw her sitting on the floor, her necklace in her hands, her body shaking, her voice broken with sobs. She was whispering again, but this time he understood a few words. "Forgive me, my son, my love." David froze, his chest heavy with sudden weight. She had a family once, he realized, and the necklace must have been all that remained of them. He wanted to step inside, to comfort her, to tell her she was not alone. But something held him back. Perhaps it was respect for her pain. Perhaps it was fear of breaking the fragile trust between them. So he stood there, hidden in the shadows, and listened to the grief of a woman who carried her past like chains. And for the first time in years, David felt his own loneliness shift into something else. A strange connection. Two souls, broken in different ways, living under one roof, both haunted by memories they could not escape. The following morning, Lyra acted as if nothing had happened. She prepared breakfast, swept the floors, worked in the fields. But David could not forget what he had seen. He looked at her differently now, not as a worker, not as a stranger, but as someone carrying a story too heavy for one person to bear. He wanted to ask her to tell him everything, but he also knew sometimes the hardest truths are spoken only when the heart is ready. And so the silent house remained, filled with whispers of the past, shadows of pain, and a growing bond neither of them could explain. But David knew one thing for certain. The widow he had hired was not just a worker. She was a mystery, and mysteries never stay buried forever. The days passed, and though Lyra remained quiet, David noticed she had begun to trust him more. She no longer avoided his gaze completely, and sometimes, in rare moments, her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. It was not joy, but it was a spark of life returning to her face. David, who had lived in silence for so long, began to feel that his house was no longer empty. One evening, after a long day on the farm, David brought food to the table. The two of them sat in silence, as usual, the only sounds the clinking of plates and the faint wind outside. But then, without warning, Lyra spoke, her voice low and steady. "You wonder about me," she said, her eyes fixed on her food. David froze, surprised that she had broken the silence first. "Yes," he admitted, "I want to know who you are, before this place, before now." For a long moment, she said nothing, as if debating whether the truth was worth sharing. Then, slowly, she placed her necklace on the table between them. It was small, made of simple metal, but carved with delicate symbols of her people. "This belonged to my husband," she said softly, "and to my son." David felt the weight of her words press against his chest. She lifted her eyes to his, and in them he saw both fire and endless sorrow. "My husband was a soldier," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "He fought in the war against your people. He fought because he believed we could protect our world, our families." She paused, her fingers trembling as they touched the necklace. "He did not return. He was taken by the war like so many others, and then came the sickness, the hunger, the debt." Her voice grew weaker, but she pushed on. "My son, he was still young, too young. I could not save him. I had nothing left, no family, no home, only this necklace." David listened in silence, his heart heavy. He had lost people too, friends, neighbors, even distant relatives in the long conflict. But hearing her story, the war suddenly felt closer, more personal. It was no longer numbers and battles. It was this woman sitting across from him, carrying loss in her very bones. "When my husband died," she whispered, "I was taken, sold into labor, passed from place to place until I ended here in this colony. No one wanted me, no one trusted me, and maybe they were right. Maybe I am cursed." Her hand shook as she pulled the necklace back in her grip, holding it tight against her chest. David leaned forward, his voice calm. "You're not cursed, Lyra. You are alive. And that means something more than you know." For the first time since she arrived, her eyes filled with tears in front of him, not hidden in the dark of night. The wall she had built around herself cracked, and the grief she had carried alone spilled into the space between them. David wanted to reach across the table, to take her hand, but he stopped himself. Instead, he gave her something she had not been offered in a long time, the space to grieve without judgment. But then, just as quickly, her tears ended, and her face hardened again. "They will come," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. David frowned. "Who will come?" "The ones who own me," she answered. "They do not forgive debt. They do not forget. I left before they could sell me again, and they will come, sooner or later." Her words chilled the air between them. David realized this was more than sorrow, it was danger. The woman he had hired was not only a widow with a broken past. She was a target, carrying enemies who could arrive at any time. That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about her words, about the shadow of men who might come to claim her. He thought about the way she whispered names into the night sky, as if speaking to ghosts. And he thought about the fear hidden inside her strength. He had wanted a worker, someone to help him with the farm. But what he had found was a soul burdened with pain, a life hunted by the past. As the night deepened, one thought burned inside him. If they came for her, would he let them take her away? Or would he stand between her and the darkness that followed her? The question had no answer yet, but in his heart, David knew his life would never be the same again. The days after Lyra's confession were different. The silence between her and David was no longer heavy. It carried meaning now. It carried secrets. David did not see her only as a worker anymore. He saw her as someone who had lost everything, yet still stood strong. And in that strength, he found a respect he had not felt in years. Slowly, Their routine began to change. Lyra no longer stayed hidden in the corners of the house. She began to sit at the table when David ate. Sometimes she even joined him outside in the fields, their hands working side by side under the sun. She spoke more, not much, but enough to make the silence less sharp. David would ask small questions, and she would answer with short words. Yet in those words, he found pieces of her soul, like tiny lights in the dark. One evening, as they shared a simple meal, David cracked a small joke about the stubborn colony animals that never listened. To his surprise, Lyra laughed, not loudly, but with a sound soft and gentle. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it startled him. For a moment, she looked younger, lighter, as if the chains of her past had loosened. That laugh stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after the meal was done. But the outside world was not blind. Whispers spread through the colony, sharper than before. Neighbors began to say things in the market, words meant for David to hear. They say he eats with her now, one voice mocked. They say she sleeps under his roof like a wife, another sneered. Humans should not mix with her kind. Nothing good will come of it, they warned. David kept his head low, but anger burned in his chest. He knew Lyra heard these words too, for he saw the shadow in her eyes when they returned from town. One afternoon, as they worked in the field, David spoke gently. You know, people talk, but I don't care what they say. Lyra paused, the sun catching the silver of her necklace. You should care, she whispered. They will not forgive you if you stand with me. They will never see me as one of them. David shrugged, his voice firm. Then let them talk. I only care about what happens here in this house on this land with us. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, as if searching his face for lies. But she found none. Only truth, only kindness. For the first time, she smiled at him, a real smile, fragile but full of something new. Hope. That night, a storm rolled over the colony, rain hammering the fields, thunder shaking the windows. Lyra stood by the fire, her hands trembling slightly at each rumble. David noticed and walked closer, offering her a blanket. You're safe here, he said softly. No one will hurt you, not while I'm here. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not turn away. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand, only for a moment, but long enough for David to feel the warmth of her trust. The bond between them grew stronger after that night. They worked together, laughed quietly together, and even sat in silence without fear. David realized that he no longer saw her as just someone he hired. He looked at her and felt something deeper, something dangerous, something like love. And Lyra, though still guarded, began to let her walls fall piece by piece. But danger was never far away. At the edge of the colony, shadows watched, waiting. The people who once owned Lyra had not forgotten her. And soon, their footsteps would cross David's land. Neither of them knew it yet, but the bond they had built would soon be tested by fire. The bond between David and Lyra had begun to feel unbreakable. Each day they worked side by side, and each night the silence in the house no longer felt empty, but alive. Yet while the farm grew with warmth and hope, danger was already moving closer, unseen but steady. One morning, David went to the market for supplies. He noticed the usual whispers, the cold stares from neighbors, but this time something else caught his attention. Two strangers stood by the edge of the square, tall men with harsh eyes, their clothes marked by symbols David had never seen before. They were not colonists, and their gaze followed him like hunters watching prey. When he returned home, his thoughts were heavy, but he said nothing, not wanting to worry Lyra. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Lyra grew restless. She looked out the window, her hands trembling as they touched her necklace. They are near, she whispered suddenly, her voice tight with fear. David turned sharply. Who is near? Her eyes darkened. The ones I told you about, they will come for me. They always do. Before David could answer, the sound of engines cut through the silence. Lights flashed outside as two vehicles stopped at the edge of his land. Three figures stepped out, their boots crunching against the dirt. Lyra gasped, her face pale. "It is them," she said, her voice breaking. "They found me." David stepped outside, his fists clenched, his heart pounding. The men approached with confident strides, their leader smiling coldly. "Human," the man called, "you are harboring what belongs to us." David's voice was calm but sharp. "She belongs to no one." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Everything has a price, and this widow still owes more than she can ever pay. Hand her over, and we will leave you in peace." Lyra stepped to the doorway, her body trembling, but her eyes fierce. "You cannot have me," she said, though her voice shook. The man sneered. "You have no choice. Alien, you were sold. You were marked. Your life is not your own." David moved closer to her, his stance firm. "She works for me now. She lives under my roof, and I won't let you take her." The men's smiles faded, replaced by anger. "You would defy us, human," the leader hissed. "Do you know what we do to those who stand in our way?" David did not move, his voice steady. "I know what I will do to anyone who tries to hurt her." For a moment, the air was thick with tension, the kind that could break into violence with a single wrong step. The men studied him, perhaps expecting fear, but finding none. Finally, the leader's smile returned, though it was thin and sharp. "Very well, keep her for now, but remember, debts are not forgotten. We will come again, and next time we will not ask." With that, they turned back to their vehicles, their engines roaring as they vanished into the night. The silence that followed was heavy. David turned to Lyra, who was clutching her necklace so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her body trembled, but her eyes shone with something deeper than fear, disbelief. "You stood for me," she whispered, as if the thought itself was impossible. David met her gaze, his voice firm. "I will always stand for you, no matter what comes." Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not only of sorrow. There was gratitude, and something more, a fragile seed of hope breaking through the soil of her despair. For the first time in years, she felt what it was like to have someone on her side. But even as warmth grew between them, both knew the truth. This was not the end of the danger. It was only the beginning. The men would return, and when they did, they would not come with words but with force. And when that day came, David would have to decide how far he was willing to go for the alien widow he had chosen to protect. After the men left, silence wrapped around the farm like a heavy cloak. The sound of their engines still echoed in David's mind, a reminder that danger was not gone but waiting. Lyra sat by the fire, her hands still trembling, her necklace clutched so tightly it left marks on her skin. David watched her, his chest tight with anger and something deeper. He had thought hiring her was only about work, but now he knew the truth. It was about her safety, her life, and what she had begun to mean to him. Days passed, but the fear did not fade. Every sound outside the house made Lyra flinch. Every stranger's voice in the market made David's eyes narrow. The colony people whispered louder now. They warned him, but he still keeps her, they said. He has lost his mind. No human risks everything for her kind. David ignored them, but the weight of their judgment grew heavier each day. One night, as rain tapped softly against the roof, David found Lyra sitting by the window, staring into the storm. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. "I should leave," she whispered suddenly, her voice heavy. David froze. "Leave? What?" Her hands tightened around the necklace. "Because I bring danger to you, to your farm. They will come again, and they will hurt you, all because of me." David stepped closer, shaking his head. "You are not the danger, Lyra. They are, and I will not let them take you." She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you stand for me, when no one else ever has?" David's voice was steady, but his heart pounded. "Because you are not just someone I hired. You are more than that now. To me, you are family, and I will not let my family be taken." Lyra's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Tears filled her eyes, running down her cheeks silently. She had been called many things in her life: slave, widow, burden, worthless, but never family, never something worth protecting. Her walls broke completely then, and she whispered, "I do not deserve this." David shook his head, his voice low but firm. "You deserve more than this. You deserve love. You deserve peace. And if you will let me, I want to give it to you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. David had not planned to say them, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. Lyra's hands trembled, her heart racing. For so long she had lived only to survive, never imagining someone could look at her and see not a burden but a partner. Her voice shook as she whispered, "You want me as your family?" David's gaze did not falter. "Yes, Lyra, I want you as my wife if you will have me." Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of rain against the window. Lyra's tears fell freely now, but her lips curved into the faintest smile. "I thought my life was finished," she whispered. "I thought love was buried with my husband. But you make me believe again." She lowered her head, her voice soft but certain. "Yes, David, I will be your wife." For the first time, true warmth filled the house. Not the warmth of fire, not the warmth of work, but the warmth of two souls choosing each other against all odds. They did not know what tomorrow would bring. They did not know when the men would return or how the colony would react. But they knew one thing. They would face it together as husband and wife, as family. And in that moment, fear turned into strength, sorrow turned into hope. The human who had once been alone and the alien widow who had once been broken had found something no war, no debt, no enemy could ever erase. They had found love. The morning after their promise, the farm looked different. The same field stretched wide. The same house stood quiet, but everything felt alive in a new way. Lyra moved through the rooms no longer as a shadow, but as someone who belonged, and David no longer saw her as a guest, but as his partner, his wife in spirit, even before the vows were spoken. News of their choice spread quickly through the colony. Some laughed, some sneered, and some shook their heads in disbelief. A human married to her kind? Impossible, they whispered. But others grew curious, some even quiet, watching from a distance as if waiting to see what would happen. The colony had seen many strange things, but never this. David and Lyra faced the stairs together. At the market, when whispers followed them, David held her hand firmly. At home, when doubts crept into her eyes, he reminded her with gentle words, "You are mine now, and I am yours. Nothing else matters." Each time, her heart grew stronger, her fear weaker, but shadows still lingered at the edge of their new life. The men who claimed her debt had not returned yet, but their threat remained like a storm waiting beyond the horizon. David prepared quietly, sharpening old tools, strengthening the fences, keeping watch at night. He knew they would come, but he also knew he would not let them win. And Lyra, once broken and afraid, now stood with him, ready to face whatever came. Weeks passed, and the farm began to flourish. The fields grew greener, the animals stronger, and the house warmer. Lyra learned the rhythms of the land, her hands steady, her laughter no longer rare. Sometimes, in the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, speaking of dreams, not fears. David would tell her stories of Earth, and Lyra would share old songs of her people. Two worlds once divided by war now met in one home. Then came the day when everything changed again. Lyra stood at the edge of the field, her hand resting on her stomach, her eyes wide with wonder. She turned to David, her voice soft. I carry new life." David's heart stopped, then filled with joy so fierce it brought tears to his eyes. A child, their child, a new beginning not only for them, but for two species that had once hated each other. He embraced her, his voice breaking. "Then we are truly a family." The colony could not ignore them anymore. Some still whispered, but others began to see them not as scandal, but as hope. Children who had once been told aliens were monsters now saw Lyra smile at them in the market. Men who had once mocked David now watched his farm prosper, stronger than before. Change was slow, but it had begun. And when the shadows finally returned, the men demanding their claim, they found something they had not expected. They found not a widow hiding in fear, but a wife standing tall beside her husband. They found not a lonely human, but a man ready to fight for his family. The battle that followed was fierce, but in the end, love proved stronger than greed. For even the darkest debt cannot chain a heart that has chosen freedom. When the dust settled, the men were gone, and the farm remained. David and Lyra stood hand in hand, their eyes on the horizon. They knew more storms would come, more whispers, more battles, but they also knew they would face them together. The human who once lived alone had chosen love. The alien widow who once carried only sorrow had chosen hope. And together, they had created something greater than either had imagined. A family. This was not the end of their story, but the beginning. A tale not of war and loss, but of healing and unity. And in the quiet of the night, as stars burned above, Lyra whispered to the sky not names of the lost, but names of the future. For now she had a husband, a home, and soon a child, and nothing in the universe could take that away.